From All Saints Church in Pasadena, California, this is Studio ASC. President Trump wants to destroy the Johnson Amendment. What is the Johnson Amendment, you might ask? This piece of legislation passed in 1954 forbids tax-exempt organizations, including churches, from campaigning for or against candidates for political office. Those who violate the rule can have their tax-exempt status revoked by the Internal Revenue Service. The namesake of the amendment, then Senator Lyndon Johnson, wasn't all that interested in churches, it turned out. He wanted to use the amendment to take out a nonprofit group run by one of his political rivals, because the group was using its tax-exempt status to accuse Johnson of being a communist. In recent years, religious conservatives have lobbied for an end to the Johnson Amendment, claiming that the rule restricts their right to free speech, although there are hardly any examples of the rule being enforced. On their behalf, President Trump has vowed to gut the amendment. The Johnson Amendment was once brought to bear on our own All Saints Church after a certain sermon came to the attention of the IRS. All Saints priest Susan Russell tells the story. So back in 2004, George Regas gave a sermon that raised the ire of the IRS. Why don't you fill us in a little bit on the history of that?
When George Regas came back to preach for us the Sunday before the election, George was our retired rector, and we had him back to preach periodically. He chose to frame the sermon around a debate between John Kerry and George Bush and Jesus. In the sermon, he explicitly said that good people of deep faith would go to the ballot box on Tuesday and vote for different candidates, and that he was not here to tell you how to vote. Then proceeded to preach a very strong anti-war sermon. Now, remembering that we were in the middle of the Iraq War, it left few conclusions about who Jesus would prefer you voted for. But it was a specifically articulated nonpartisan sermon. He was preaching about the values of peace and justice, which are core to the values of All Saints Church.
And was there any expectation that there would be fallout from this sermon?
It was such a paradigmatically normal sermon for All Saints Church that we left Sunday sort of fired up, and I think most of us filed it away until we got the paperwork from the IRS months later. Their accusation was that we had crossed the line on the Johnson Amendment because it was a partisan advocacy sermon happening within the election cycle.
Had there ever been a case like this previously?
We were a test case, we felt, given that there really had not been this sort of prosecution before. It was a months-long process during which we attempted to make our case to the IRS that we had maybe come up to the line but had intentionally not crossed it. It was an expensive process, but it was also an opportunity. We drew the attention of the nation to a church that was willing to speak out about its values. We were called to preach peace in season and out of season, and that included the election season. It challenged us to live out our values in that moment. Are we willing to both make our case and pay the cost of discipleship? And at the end of the day, I think it was what we were called to do in that moment.
It turned out kind of much ado about nothing, right? The IRS just eventually let the investigation drop.
We were neither exonerated nor prosecuted. It just sort of went away.
We asked All Saints Rector Mike Kinman to give us his opinion of the Johnson Amendment. Spoiler alert, the outspoken rector is in favor of the amendment.
I'm in favor of the Johnson Amendment for several reasons. The first is that there is an absolute role for churches and faith communities in politics, and that is being the prophet before the throne. It is not so much to determine who sits on the throne or to try to be a part of sitting on the throne ourselves. Christianity has always been at its best when we have not been synonymous with the government, but when we have been a force that is trying to hold governments to be their moral and ethical best. What concerns me in the effort to get rid of the Johnson Amendment, well, there are several things that concern me about this. The first is that the Johnson Amendment is portrayed as an attack on religious liberty, an attack on freedom of speech. And in truth, it is neither. I have been to places where there are absolutely attacks on religious liberty, places like South Sudan, where people, because of their faith, literally had their lives in danger. When we, as Christians in a nation that privileges Christianity, and where there really is a true freedom of worship in this country, where we start talking about that we're having our religious freedom infringed, we're cheapening the idea of religious persecution, and it is a disservice, at least, and blasphemous at most, to people around the world who suffer very real persecution, even unto death, for their religious beliefs.
Well, churches still have the right to be involved in politics.
Absolutely. The root of politics, polis, is people. And if the church is not involved in politics, you have to ask the question, what are we doing? Jesus was intensely political. Jesus spoke and acted continually on the things that affected people. And we are called to be as vocal as Jesus was in the cause of those who are most marginalized, targeted, and oppressed. The other thing that is important to note about the Johnson Amendment is no one is saying that if you violate this, you're going to jail. It's saying we're given a benefit by the government, and that benefit is a tax-exempt status as a church. It gives every faith community a choice. If we felt as All Saints Church that we absolutely were called by our faith to either support or denounce a candidate for office, then we have every right to do that, and that right is protected by the First Amendment for us to do that. We just would forfeit our tax-exempt status doing that, which we have to know that's not the same as being thrown into jail for it. Churches have often, and I've engaged on behalf of the church, in civil disobedience. The power of civil disobedience is being willing to accept and even welcome sanction because of the power of your beliefs. By the way, I, as a private citizen and a priest, I'm free to endorse a candidate. So my personal freedom of speech, I could stand up in my own home, I could interview with a newspaper, in any number of arenas, I could endorse a candidate. I just can't do it using the pulpit and the resources of All Saints Church or another church. So one of the things that President Trump and others like to talk about is, well, the First Amendment rights of clergy are being restricted. No, my First Amendment rights are not being restricted. I can say whatever I want and usually do. And the only thing I can't do is do that from the All Saints pulpit and have us continue to enjoy that tax benefit.
Now, there's some worry as churches become engaged politically that contributions to churches may end up being kind of a loophole in campaign financing.
This is the very reason that this is an issue. Right now, political contributions are not tax deductible. If you have churches able to endorse a candidate, then you can very easily get to a point where people can contribute to churches and have the churches turn those contributions over to a political campaign. Well, this does two things. First of all, the contributors would now get a tax exemption to contribute to a political campaign. And the second thing is churches don't have to release names of donors. So this is a huge loophole around what, frankly, few campaign finance laws we have left. And my hunch is this is what is truly behind the forces that want to repeal the Johnson Amendment. It is not about religious freedom. It is not about freedom of speech. It is about trying to find even more ways to have unfettered access for money into politics. This is about whether or not churches should become essentially a new limb of a political party. And the power of churches is actually in our independence from specific candidates and political parties so that we can hold them accountable to our most dearly held beliefs.
We also spoke to Julianna Serrano, All Saints Senior Associate for Peace and Justice, whose job places her at the intersection of religion and politics. We're here with Julianna Serrano.
Hi.
How are you?
Good. I'm excited.
Julianna wears many hats here at All Saints Church.
And in the Pasadena community.
You address a lot of issues in your work, right? Immigration rights being one, economic
Yes.
justice.
Yes.
What else?
We're working diligently with community partners on the issue of immigration. It's a huge issue right now because of the declarations that President Trump has made. We work on healthcare and education. We also work on climate change and the environment. Racial justice is a big component of peace and justice work here at All Saints Church as well. So it's pretty far-reaching, and everything intersects.
You know, there's a lot of desire on individuals' parts to respond in some way.
Mm-hmm.
And I know you're working on that.
There are ways that we can stand with and stand up for those who are impacted, encouraging all of us to know our rights, to empower ourselves with the knowledge of our Constitution, and to empower ourselves with the knowledge of how to respond when we're engaged with law enforcement or ICE officials.
We're also very focused on influencing policy and
Yes.
legislation.
Yes. I love policy. I love doing political activism related to policy. Lobbying for me is a really fun experience. And I am really glad that I was able to be part of a delegation that recently went up to the California State Capitol lobbying on SB 54, which is the California Values Act, the bill that seeks to make the state of California a sanctuary state, that the state would mandate that our local law enforcement agencies are prohibited from interacting with ICE agents in immigration and deportation efforts.
You know, we've been talking with both Mike and Susan about the Johnson Amendment to really think about the line between political action and church. It sounds like you live that boundary.
Yes, in that there is a line that I have to walk. The work that I do as an individual within the scope of this institution prohibits me from doing something like endorsing a political candidate. And I'm very cautious of that and walk that line appropriately. That being said, nonprofit organizations are in fact entitled to do political engagement work. And I would say that faith communities should always do political engagement work. Our Christian faith is incredibly political. I got some feedback from someone once. I was going to write a blog for a church-related, not our church, another church-related blog. And the feedback I got back was, thanks so much for your article, but it was a little too political. And I thought, wow, really? Did you know about Jesus? I mean, Jesus Christ himself was an incredibly political figure. And I think that our calling is to be political figures in the world.
Sacred resistance, of course, is more than just tangling with the IRS. As we become involved in other people's struggles, we get tangled up in all kinds of issues. Najiba Saeed, professor at Claremont School of Theology, recently gave a presentation at All Saints Church. She asked a provocative question. Just what exactly is an ally?
So when you're taking on a whole culture of violence, think about nearly every prophet, whether they were of the Abrahamic or other traditions, they were essentially looking at cultures of violence because they would sit with those who were the most marginalized. No great religion grew in the beginning with the most powerful. No great religion grew with those that had everything. All great prophets sat with those who were physically marginalized in any society. So this ethic of hope is something we need to imbibe from our traditions. To take on a whole culture of violence means that one must see something different than what is happening in front of you. And this is a tool that the spiritualization of conflict, the spiritualization of struggle brings to the table. It brings a resilience and a strength to say, I am going to invest in something that will not bring me back money, that will not bring me back power, that will not get me invitations into the halls of power, because I want to be in the space with those that are holiest and most sacred. So that's an irrational choice. It works against the transactional notion that justice is achieved by winds of power in which the scales of justice mean that I benefit individually. that I get something out of this. So part of working intersectionally is to stand up with those with whom you get no benefit from. Guess what? Maybe you even get vilified for that. To be an ally means you must risk something bodily. To be an ally means you must risk something intellectually. To be an ally means you must risk something spiritually. So when we want to serve others, an ally is someone who decenters themselves and centers the voices and the struggles and the work of those who are directly affected by an issue. An ally is someone who amplifies the work, the efforts, the stories of those who are directly working on the issue and are affected by it. An ally is someone who is a profound listener, who, when they show up, asks, how can I serve? Not this is what you should do, or I have some ideas for you. So when we go into spaces, it's this ability to listen to every voice and not to determine the significance or insignificance of a voice based on my calculus of power.